Welcome to our channel. Today, we bring you a heart-wrenching story from Reddit about a daughter who sacrificed everything to care for her father, only to face betrayal and injustice. But when tragedy strikes, will she continue to sacrifice or stand up for herself? Let's find out together. My father left my brother as the sole heir after he cared for him following my mother's death, arguing that my brother has children and I do not. But now that he is sick, there is no one to care for him. 3 years ago, I lost my mother to cancer. Now it's just my dad, my older brother, and me. Since my mom's death, my dad hasn't been the same person. He loved her with all his heart, and her loss devastated him in ways words can hardly describe. It's evident that he has never fully recovered, and the pain has deeply affected his emotional and mental well-being. Watching him suffer has been incredibly painful for me. For the past 2.5 years, I have dedicated almost all my time and energy to caring for my dad. I used to have a job and a life away from home, but seeing the state my dad was in after my mom's death, I felt he needed my help. I decided to move back home to support him during this difficult time. My older brother, on the other hand, has his own family to take care of. He's married and lives in another city with his wife and children. Because of his responsibilities and commitments, he chose not to return home to live with my dad. That meant the responsibility of caring for him fell mostly on me. Although it hasn't been easy, I have tried to do my best for him. For 2.5 years, I poured my heart and soul into taking care of my dad. I tried to support him in every way I could, but it was very difficult. My dad had a history of drinking and gambling years ago. He gave it up for my mom, but after her death, it seemed like he lost all motivation and fell back into those harmful habits. My dad would go days without showering, often refused to eat the meals I prepared for him, and was essentially a shadow of himself. I took charge of all his meals and medications, ensuring he received the care he needed. Often, I had to go to the bar late at night to pick him up, exhausted from my own day, but I was always there for him. I didn't want him to end up hurting himself. Anyone who has been through a similar situation understands how exhausting it is to care for someone in such a state. It's not an easy task to endure, but I did it out of love for my dad. I wanted him to heal, to find some peace, and to feel like himself again. Meanwhile, my brother and his wife offered no support. They were absent the entire time. My brother only visited once a year for Christmas, pretending to be involved in my dad's life, but the reality was far different. He never called to ask how my dad was doing and didn't even answer my dad's calls most of the time. It was deeply frustrating and painful to see how disconnected my brother was, leaving me to handle everything while he carried on with his life as if nothing had changed after my mom's death. The problem arose when it came time for my dad to write his will and divide his assets. My mom had always told me she wanted my brother and me to inherit equally because we were both her children and she believed in fairness. For context, the house my dad currently lives in originally belonged to my mom's grandfather. It was a wedding gift to her and eventually transferred to my dad's name after her death. Naturally, I assumed he would honor my mom's wishes and leave the house to both my brother and me. To my surprise, my dad informed me that he planned to name only my brother as his sole heir, not just to the house, but also to all his financial assets and savings. Everything would go to my brother. I want to be clear, I'm not a greedy person. I wouldn't have minded if he chose not to give me any money, but this decision made no sense to me. Why would he favor my brother when I was the one who had been by his side all this time? When I asked my dad about his reasoning, his response made everything worse. He said leaving me any property or money would be a waste because, unlike my brother, I don't have a family of my own. Since my brother has children, they could make better use of the inheritance. If I had chosen not to have children, this comment might not have hurt me as much. But the truth is, I deeply desire to have a child, yet I haven't been able to. To give context, I was married once, and my ex-husband and I desperately tried to have children. Every time I got pregnant, I felt like I was finally going to have one, but the universe had other plans. The last miscarriage was the most devastating of all. It completely broke me. I couldn't function for days afterward. To make matters worse, my ex-husband and his family were extremely abusive to me, both emotionally and mentally. They treated me as if I were somehow defective because I couldn't give him a child. When I suffered my last miscarriage, my ex made it clear that he had no intention of staying by my side. After that marriage, I was so shaken, so deeply scarred by the experience that I haven't been able to enter another relationship. So when my dad emphasized that I didn't have children, it was like a dagger straight to my heart. He knew, my whole family knew what I had gone through. My mom had supported me and understood that what happened wasn't my fault. But here was my dad, essentially blaming me for something completely out of my control. I told my dad that regardless of whether I could give him grandchildren or not, I was still his daughter. I reminded him that both my brother and I deserve to be loved equally and that the inheritance should be divided fairly. However, my dad said he couldn't help but love my brother more because he had given him grandchildren. He didn't even try to hide it or claim it was just my perception. He fully admitted that he loved him more. He went on to explain that he wanted my brother to inherit everything so that his children, my dad's grandchildren, could enjoy a good life without debts. And as if that wasn't painful enough, he accused me of being greedy for even questioning his decision. I felt like all the sacrifices I had made for my dad, all the love and care I had shown him, didn't matter in the end. After that painful conversation with my dad, I started to see him differently. I began questioning why I was trying so hard to care for him while neglecting my own life. Why was I staying in this situation when I could move on, find a better job, and start living for myself? If he wasn't going to appreciate all the sacrifices I was making, why should I keep doing it? So that's exactly what I did. I started looking for a new job with better pay, something that would allow me to move away and build a different kind of life. When I finally got an offer, I didn't waste any time. I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother to tell my dad in advance. Later, when my dad called, confused and upset, asking where I was and why my things were no longer in the house, I simply told him I had moved out. He was furious because he didn't know who would do all the things I had been doing for him. I replied, "You can take care of yourself or ask my brother and his wife for help." He must have called my brother for help because the next call came from him. My brother was angry, just like my dad, for leaving him alone. I didn't take it seriously. I told my brother that if he was so concerned about dad, then he should do the work I had been doing. It was his turn now. After that, no one bothered me, and I began to live my life a little. It's been 10 months since I moved away from my hometown, and honestly, life in my new city is so much better now. I finally have a life of my own without having to make sacrifices for anyone else. That might sound selfish, but I think I've done enough for my dad and my family. It's time to prioritize myself. Then, last week, I got a call from my brother. He told me that dad had suffered a stroke. He said that although dad was still alive, his condition was critical and the situation seemed serious. Since my brother is listed as my dad's emergency contact, the hospital reached out to him first. My brother then told me that although he and his wife wanted to visit dad, they were tied up with their jobs and projects they couldn't leave. He asked me to fly back home and take care of dad until he could find time in his schedule to come. My brother emphasized that taking care of dad this time would only be temporary, as if that made the request any less frustrating. After all this time, after everything that had happened, he expected me to drop everything again and take on the responsibility as I had in the past. It was the same story, where I would sacrifice my life because to them it didn't matter and they wouldn't do the same since they saw their lives as more valuable. I asked him to explain more clearly what he meant by temporary. My brother finally admitted that dad now required 24-hour care due to the severity of his condition. Then he mentioned that his wife was pregnant again, so even when he came, he could only stay with dad for a few days. In other words, temporary was practically permanent as he committed to only very short visits. I quickly said no, but I explained that while I wouldn't mind visiting dad for a few days, I couldn't and wouldn't stay any longer. I suggested that he hire a full-time caregiver or nurse and pay for it himself if he couldn't care for dad. As far as I was concerned, I wasn't going to put my life on hold for either of them. I don't think he expected that response from me, and it didn't sit well with him. His argument to convince me was that my job wasn't as important as his, and that I should take an extended leave or even quit my job altogether to prioritize our family. Telling me that didn't help his case. What followed was him saying that families make sacrifices for each other. I reminded my brother that dad was also his family and that he was essentially trying to transfer his responsibility to me, while he and his wife continued living their lives as if nothing had happened. I reminded him that I had already spent 2.5 years taking care of dad, while he had practically done nothing to help during that time. My brother got angry and accused me of being immature for keeping score. He even went as far as to say that if mom were alive, she would be ashamed of me for refusing to care for dad. He was using every manipulative tactic in the book, even invoking mom to guilt trip me. I responded sarcastically, telling him that if mom were alive, she would more likely be ashamed of him for avoiding his duties as the eldest son and trying to force his sister to handle everything. Since that conversation, we haven't spoken, and I know he's angry with me. But I don't care, and I don't think I've done anything wrong in this situation. It's time for someone else to step up. It's not my job to take care of dad. Update 1. I want to clarify a few things. I'm not just angry with my dad for leaving everything to my brother. I'm also deeply hurt and frustrated by the fact that he never acknowledged what I did for him during all those years, all the sacrifices I made. He never recognized or truly appreciated it. I feel like he saw it as something I was obligated to do, not as a favor I was doing for him. Growing up, my dad was never really present. It was always mom who took care of me and my brother. She was the one who was there for us, which explains why my brother doesn't really care about dad either. Both my brother and I were always closer to mom for that reason. She was the one who held everything together, while dad was distant and preoccupied with his own affairs. When mom had cancer, both my brother and I did our best to be there for her. We visited her as much as we could, trying to offer her comfort and support. But in the end, we still relied on her, not on dad. After her death, I had two options: move on with my life like my brother did, or stay behind to take care of dad. My brother went back to his family, resumed his routine, and continued living his life as if nothing had changed. I, on the other hand, made the difficult decision to leave my job and move back to my hometown. I took a poorly paid job just to be close to dad and care for him. I'm not, or at least I wasn't, the kind of person who could abandon others so easily. Living with dad wasn't easy. He used to come home drunk every night. When he was intoxicated, he became aggressive and a real problem. It wasn't just the drinking, it was also the fact that he wasted all his money on gambling and alcohol. Despite all this, he never hesitated to ask me for money. The strange thing is that he didn't seem to have spent everything he had, perhaps because I managed the finances. I don't know if I can say the same for the time since I've been gone. Even with all these challenges, I took on the responsibility of cooking for him, cleaning up after him, and ensuring the bills were paid. I was the one making sure he had everything he needed, and it felt like I was doing it all alone. Meanwhile, my brother didn't lift a finger to help. Yet, for some reason, my brother is the child who gets all the praise and love from dad, simply because he has children and I don't. The fact that I sacrificed so much seemed to go completely unnoticed. It was as if everything I did didn't matter as much simply because I wasn't a mother. This blatant favoritism is deeply unfair. This is exactly why I refused to quit my job, put my life on hold, and move back in with dad again. After everything I've endured, I refuse to let myself be in the same position of sacrificing my well-being for someone who refuses to see or appreciate the value of what I've already done. I visited my dad this week, and it was a strange experience. The stroke had a significant impact on him, particularly on his ability to speak. He struggles a bit to find the right words and speaks more slowly now, but the doctors are optimistic that with the right lifestyle changes, he could regain most of his abilities and return to a more normal life. When I arrived, my dad seemed genuinely happy to see me. I didn't hug him, but with difficulty, he told me how much he had missed me over the past few months. We sat down and talked for a while, catching up. He told me how disappointed he was that my brother and his wife still hadn't visited him, which I found particularly surprising. Then my dad opened up to me in a way I didn't expect. He said how much he wished I had never moved out and how lonely he felt living in the house by himself. He admitted that my brother never called or visited and that I was the only child who had truly been there for him. I smiled, feeling a mix of emotions, and simply thanked him for finally acknowledging the truth. That's when my dad started suggesting that I should consider moving back in with him now that he'd had a stroke. He said that, more than ever, he needed a lot of care and that I could help him just as I had before. I told him that things were different now and that I couldn't just go back to the way things used to be. I explained that I could stay for a few days to make sure he was okay, but he needed to hire a caregiver or convince my brother to step in and help. My dad didn't take that well at all. He immediately argued that he didn't want a stranger taking care of him when he had me. I replied that my brother wasn't a stranger and could do just as good a job as I could if he wanted to. But my dad insisted that I was the one who had to take care of him, while I kept repeating that I was only visiting because I wasn't a monster, but I wasn't going to sacrifice anything else to take care of him. Those were his options, so he had better start thinking about what he wanted to do. Then, as if he hadn't heard a single word I'd said, and to rub salt in the wound, he said, "You don't even have a family, and you can easily leave your job. Just move back in with me and take care of me. The doctor says someone needs to monitor me closely, and no one can do that better than you." I told him that maybe he was right, maybe no one could do a better job than me, but I didn't want to do it, so that wouldn't change anything. Maybe under different circumstances, I would have wanted to do it to sacrifice for my father. But if he didn't see me as a daughter and only viewed me as a servant, then I wasn't going to make a sacrifice for someone I didn't care about in that way. Even though I was incredibly angry, I couldn't help but notice that, despite his precarious position, he wasn't making any effort to repair things between us. It's not that an apology would have changed anything. I had already decided before traveling that I wasn't going to stay and take care of him. But it was the bare minimum a decent person would do after treating someone so poorly. I asked my dad, "Would you talk to my brother this way? Would you ever expect him to leave his job and family just to move in with you?" I had genuinely hoped he would see the double standard in how he treated me compared to my brother. But hope was just that. Hope. My dad still thought I should do it because in his eyes, my brother was doing something important and I wasn't. What I said next was blunt. Just because I'm your daughter doesn't mean I'm automatically here to serve you. Maybe my brother's family and work are more important, but my life and my job are more important to me than taking care of you. So there's not much left to discuss. At this point, my dad started crying, probably because he saw his chances slipping away, and immediately argued that he was sick, that he was suffering, and that no one else seemed to want to be there for him. He told me how terrified and depressed he felt living alone in that big house. I told him it was entirely his fault because I had been by his side, but he didn't value me enough, and now he was in this predicament. He wasn't going to convince me with pity. I had already done everything a daughter should do for a father, so there was nothing left for him. I asked him what my brother had done to deserve his favoritism, and before he could answer, I answered for him, nothing. Well, now you're alone and there's not much I want to do either, I told him. The expectation that I alone should make sacrifices while my brother continued his life without any pressure at all was deeply unfair. But I wasn't entirely heartless, so I proposed an excellent idea. If my brother couldn't leave his job or sacrifice his life for him, perhaps my father should move in with my brother. That idea seemed absurd to my father, and if I had proposed it to my brother, I'm sure he would have thought the same. My dad started sobbing and accused me of holding a grudge against him, especially because he had decided to leave his inheritance to my brother. He seemed to think that was the reason I was being unreasonable and unhelpful. My father was so desperate that he tried to appeal to my emotions, saying that one day, when he was no longer around, I would regret not helping him. But at that point, I felt nothing. I wasn't going to be left with a guilty conscience. I told him that his decisions about the inheritance had nothing to do with my feelings in this situation, and that with my new life, I was building my own legacy, something I could have started long ago if I hadn't wasted so much time with him. After that discussion, I felt I had done what I needed to do, which was to check on my father. But I wasn't going to stay a second longer with him in the hospital. He has since been discharged, but I haven't gone to pick him up or taken him home. I've spent the remaining days I had in the city catching up on things I left behind. As far as I know, not even my brother has visited him in the hospital. In fact, my brother called me to ask how my dad was doing. That's right, during all this time, my brother hasn't visited him once. He has only talked to me to get updates about our dad, but he hasn't made any effort to see him in person. He's even gotten angry at me for not staying with our father. Now that Dad is back home, my brother is finally planning to visit him. Supposedly, he'll go tomorrow. Yes, you read that right. After all this time, my brother hasn't visited once. But now that Dad is at home, he's finally coming. And I guess tomorrow I'll find out whether his visit will be just more of the same excuses or if he's finally ready to take some responsibility and contribute in some way. That's the best chance my father has now. He's been living with a caregiver arranged by the hospital, but that won't last long. After that, in the best case scenario, it will be my brother's responsibility. It's been a while since my last update, and I know some of you have been wondering how things are going. First off, no, I didn't move back into my dad's house no matter how much he and my brother begged me to. I'm still living in my city on my own and continuing with the same wonderful job I had before. My brother has agreed to pay for a caregiver, someone who stays with my dad full time. However, since my dad has been improving, according to my brother, it's no longer necessary for the caregiver to be there 24/7. I haven't spoken to my dad during all this time, and honestly, I'm okay with that. My brother keeps urging me to call him, saying that my dad wants to reconnect with me, but it's not exactly one of my priorities right now.
Yeah.
Frankly, I'd rather clean out the garage at home than call him. After the last conversation we had, there's really nothing left to say between us. I've made my peace with that, and I feel pretty good about the situation. My brother probably also wants me to reconnect so I can help take care of my dad, or at least chip in for the caregiver's salary. But I think it's only fair that he continues to handle it since he's inheriting the house and whatever money is left. That way, he can recover everything he's invested in taking care of our dad. And for anyone who thinks our estrangement is all about money, well, they'd be absolutely right. Money does matter to me because if I stayed by his side helping like a servant only to end up with nothing, I'd be wasting my best years. I'd end up broke, exhausted, and with limited job prospects. After 3 years of battling his stroke, my father has passed away. From what my brother told me, he didn't live a very healthy lifestyle in his final years. I attended the funeral to pay my respects, especially to friends and family members with whom I have a more cordial relationship, but I didn't stick around to discuss his will with the lawyer. I wasn't expecting anything, so after the burial, I left. But a week later, my brother called to update me on the infamous will. And yes, he inherited the house, though there was practically no cash left. However, there was a surprise in the inheritance. The house had a mortgage that my father had recently taken out. We believe the money was spent on gambling again, as there's no trace of it. My brother is now torn between refusing the inheritance or accepting it and selling the house to pay off the mortgage. Either way, my father managed to mess things up for him quite thoroughly. The value of the house barely covers the mortgage, let alone the expenses my brother incurred while caring for our dad over the years. I told him, "Welcome to my world, dear brother. Now you know what it feels like for our father to leave you with nothing after taking everything." This also explains why my dad spent his final days alone in the hospital, as even my brother didn't visit him before he passed. At the funeral, it was just my brother, without his family, me, a couple of family friends, specifically friends of my mom, and one distant relative of my dad. I'm not sure what decision my brother will make, but this feels like my dad's final screw you to his kids. Edit. My brother has decided not to accept the inheritance because the house's value turned out to be even lower than the mortgage. The house was in a terrible state due to the last few months my dad lived there, so it wasn't exactly worth taking on.